There are revelations in Genoa City that do not arrive like thunder from a clear sky, but like poison released slowly into the bloodstream, creeping unseen until every heartbeat begins to feel dangerous. This is one of those revelations. The kind that does not merely embarrass a family or expose an old betrayal, but rips through the very architecture of identity, love, and memory. And this time, the blast radius is merciless. At the center of it stands Victor, cold, watchful, and devastatingly certain of his timing, a man who has spent decades understanding that the most effective way to destroy an enemy is not to strike at their fortune first, but at the story they tell themselves in order to survive. For Phyllis, that story has always been built on reinvention, on her ability to outrun yesterday and bend the truth until it becomes something almost noble. But when Victor decides the time has come to bring one of her oldest lies into the light, the room itself seems to change shape. What begins as a confrontation quickly mutates into something far more brutal, because Victor is not exposing an affair or a financial deception or one more manipulative scheme destined to become just another scandal in a city addicted to scandal. He is unveiling the possibility that the foundation of Daniel's entire life has been forged on fraudulent proof, buried motives, and the deliberate engineering of a false bloodline. And once that possibility enters the air, no one standing nearby can remain untouched. Victor does not rush. He never does when the pain of others is about to serve a purpose. In front of witnesses whose shock only deepens the humiliation, he produces documents, lab records, and a chain of evidence that feels too precise to dismiss as another corporate ambush. Every page lands with the force of an accusation sharpened over years. The claim is staggering. The DNA file, long accepted as proof of Daniel's parentage, was falsified. Not mistaken, not misread, not damaged by clerical error, but deliberately manipulated. The moment is not simply explosive because of what it implies about Daniel and Danny. It is explosive because it immediately turns Phyllis from chaotic survivor into possible architect of one of the cruelest deceptions imaginable. For years, she has fought like a woman, convinced that protecting her children justified nearly anything. But protection and possession are dangerously close cousins, and Victor's evidence suggests she may have crossed that line long ago, shaping reality itself to keep control over who Daniel was allowed to be, who he was allowed to belong to, and which truths were too dangerous for him ever to know. Daniel's collapse is silent at first, and that silence is far more painful than rage. It is the silence of a man whose entire emotional spine has just been snapped in public. He does not immediately lash out because the mind cannot absorb that level of destruction in a single breath. The name he has carried, the father he believed formed part of his identity, the family narrative that explained his place in the world, all of it suddenly becomes unstable. The humiliation is not merely private grief exposed before others. It is the sickening realization that every memory may now require re-examination. Every old conflict may contain meanings he never understood. Every sacrifice around him may have been contaminated by a secret he did not consent to carry. For a man already shaped by years of pain, mistakes, distance, and attempts at rebuilding, this revelation is not just another crisis. It is annihilation, dressed as information. Daniel does not know whether to be angrier at Victor for weaponizing the truth, at Phyllis for possibly manufacturing it, or at himself for being the last person to see that his own life might have been arranged like a stage set by people who believed they knew what he could handle. Phyllis, who has survived countless implosions by talking faster than consequences can catch her, finds herself cornered in a way she has not been in years. Panic flashes across her not simply because the evidence looks devastating, but because she recognizes the structure of Victor's assault. This is not an accusation meant to provoke a denial. It is a trap designed to make denial look like confession. And yet Phyllis cannot help herself. She tries to push back, to undermine the records, to call the timing suspicious, to turn the room against Victor by reminding everyone how often he has used private pain as a strategic instrument. In another situation, that argument might have worked. It even carries an element of truth. Victor is exploiting agony. But truth about Victor does not erase truth about her. And that is where the terror begins to crack her composure. Because beneath the outrage and frantic self-defense lies a more frightening possibility. That parts of this secret have grown so old, so layered, and so deeply buried beneath Phyllis's own revisions of memory, that even she can no longer cleanly separate the lie she told from the lie she came to need. She has lived with this hidden fracture for so long that exposure threatens not only her relationships, but her idea of herself as a mother whose damage was at least rooted in love. The city around them immediately begins to shift its gaze toward Jack, because in Genoa City no deeply buried secret ever exists in isolation. Jack is not merely adjacent to scandal, he is magnetized by it, and his history with Phyllis makes him an irresistible point of suspicion. The possibility that he may be connected to the falsified records, whether through knowledge, emotional entanglement, or a more direct role, turns an already devastating revelation into a multiplying storm. Jack's first response is not pure indignation but stunned dread, because he understands at once what this could cost him. His life has been built on repeated attempts to become better than the chaos around him, better than the grudges that define Victor, better than the selfish impulses that have destroyed his family more than once. Yet Jack also knows how vulnerable he is to old emotional weak spots, especially where Phyllis is concerned. If he helped her, even partially, even years ago under circumstances that felt urgent or morally gray, then his silence has become complicity. And if he did not help her, the perception alone may still detonate everything he has worked to repair. That is the cruelty of secrets involving blood and family. Innocence becomes difficult to prove because the stain of proximity is almost enough. Victor watches all of this with the hardened patience of a man who believes exposure is its own form of justice. But justice is not his only motive. It never is. There is calculation beneath the righteousness, and the people in that room know it. Victor does not blow open a lie of this magnitude unless he expects the fallout to rearrange loyalties in ways that benefit him. He understands that Phyllis destabilized is dangerous, Jack under suspicion is weakened, and Daniel in search of truth is vulnerable to manipulation from every side. More than that, Victor knows that when people discover their lives were built on falsehood, they often begin making reckless choices in the name of reclaiming agency. Recklessness creates openings. Openings create leverage, and leverage is Victor's preferred currency. He may present himself as the man who refuses to let deception stand, but beneath that posture is a colder ambition, to force everyone touched by this lie into positions where they either need him, fear him, or are too damaged to resist him effectively. That is what makes his revelation so sinister. He is not merely detonating the past. He is shaping the battlefield of the future. Daniel does what wounded men often do when the world becomes unrecognizable. He chooses movement over paralysis. He decides to investigate on his own, partly because he cannot bear the thought of being handled by anyone else again, and partly because dependence now feels like a humiliation he can no longer survive. If his identity has been manipulated, then reclaiming truth becomes the only thing that resembles oxygen. But his investigation is not noble in a clean, heroic sense. It is driven by anger, obsession, and the fear that if he stops digging even for a moment, he will have to sit inside the emptiness that has opened in him. He begins retracing records, timelines, medical histories, and emotional inconsistencies from long before he had the maturity to question them. Every step forward yields something worse than clarity. There are missing pages where there should be full files. There are dates that do not align. There are signatures that appear legitimate until examined too closely. There are whispers of another lab, another payment, another person who benefited from the fiction. Soon Daniel begins to realize that the DNA fraud may not have been the act of one desperate mother trying to hold together a life spiraling out of control. It may have been part of a larger network of concealment involving rivalries, power plays, and strategic emotional engineering that predates what he thought the story even was. That realization changes the shape of his anger. At first, it is aimed almost entirely at Phyllis. And she deserves it. Whether she started the lie or merely preserved it, she allowed him to live inside a false reality. But as Daniel digs deeper, he begins to suspect that his life may have been treated as a piece on a board by more than one player. That possibility is almost worse than discovering his paternity was hidden. It means he may never have been the center of the story at all. He may have been the instrument through which adults settled scores, secured relationships, or protected reputations. To a son, there is no cruelty quite like learning that the truth about his birth might have mattered less to the people around him than what they could gain by controlling it. That thought corrodes him. It turns grief into fury, and fury into obsession. And obsession makes Daniel increasingly isolated, because the more determined he becomes, the more everyone around him begins to fear what he will uncover, and what he might become in the process. Phyllis, meanwhile, begins to unravel in layers. Publicly, she still fights, still lunges toward control, still insists that Victor is twisting facts and exploiting a deeply private matter for his own agenda. But privately, she is being crushed by the mathematical certainty that decades of emotional improvisation can no longer protect her. She replays every decision that led here, every compromise rationalized in the name of survival, every moment she believes she could outmanage the consequences, because love made the risk worth it. Yet what terrifies her most is not prison, disgrace, or the destruction of her reputation. It is the look in Daniel's eyes once belief dies. For all her flaws, Phyllis has always needed to think that beneath the chaos, her children would understand that she loved them ferociously. If Daniel begins to see her not as a flawed mother, but as the person who stole his truth, then something in her own identity may collapse permanently. That fear makes her more volatile, not less. Cornered animals rarely become reasonable. They become dangerous. Phyllis starts reaching for old instincts, burying records, pressuring contacts, trying to locate weak links in Victor's evidence, and even probing Jack to determine how much he truly remembers or knows. The more she panics, the more destructive she becomes, because desperation has always been her most catastrophic form of honesty. Jack's role in the unfolding disaster becomes increasingly tortured. Even if his direct involvement remains uncertain, the emotional burden is immediate. He knows Phyllis well enough to recognize when her fear is genuine, and that recognition becomes its own trap. Sympathy risks implicating him further. Distance risks making him appear cold, guilty, or strategic. And Daniel's pain cuts deeper than Jack wants to admit, because Daniel is not just collateral damage in another Newman Abbott war. He is a man whose sense of self has been hacked apart, and Jack has spent enough of his own life wrestling with family fractures to understand how permanent that kind of injury can be. But empathy does not equal innocence, and Victor senses the hesitation in Jack almost instantly. He presses where it hurts most, subtly feeding the suspicion that Jack may have helped Phyllis either out of love, weakness, or a misplaced belief that some truths are too explosive to surface. This is how Victor operates at his most lethal. He does not need proof of every detail. He only needs to isolate the emotional fault line and apply pressure until those standing on it begin to crack under the weight of implication. As Daniel's search intensifies, new possibilities emerge, each uglier than the last. He begins to suspect that the fake DNA file may have been created not simply to protect a relationship, but to erase another man from the story entirely. That possibility introduces an unbearable question. Who was so threatening, so inconvenient, or so dangerous that his connection to Daniel needed to be buried for years? Was he someone unstable, someone powerful, someone already woven into the city's endless web of rivalries? Or was he a man whose existence would have destroyed a fragile emotional arrangement Phyllis could not bear to lose? Daniel's search for a biological answer becomes inseparable from a psychological one. He is no longer just asking who his father is. He is asking what version of reality the adults around him chose over the truth, and why they believed he had no right to decide for himself. The deeper he goes, the more he starts to sense that this mystery touches old vendettas between names far bigger than his own, suggesting that his identity may have been edited to preserve a chain of consequences that would have exploded long ago if left unchecked. Victor, predictably, refuses to retreat after the initial revelation. In fact, he grows more intrusive, because he senses that the instability he has unleashed can still be refined into advantage. He offers fragments instead of full answers, forcing Daniel and others to keep orbiting him for access to what he claims to know. It is an old tactic, cruel but effective. Daniel hates him for it, but hatred is not immunity. Victor possesses records, sources, and a scale of reach that few can challenge, and Daniel soon finds himself in the humiliating position of needing information from the very man who used his pain as spectacle. This dependence infuriates him, because it feels like another violation layered atop the first. Yet Victor uses that frustration to test Daniel, to see whether he can be hardened, influenced, perhaps even turned. In Victor's worldview, emotional devastation can either destroy a man or forge him into something more useful. The danger is that Daniel, stripped of certainty and driven by wounded pride, may start adopting methods he once would have rejected, proving that a search for truth can mutate into an apprenticeship in ruthlessness if guided by the wrong hands. Phyllis sees this and begins to panic on an entirely new level. The threat is no longer limited to her secret coming apart. The threat is that Daniel, in trying to recover what was stolen, may be transformed by Victor into someone colder, more vengeful, more strategically numb. This possibility forces Phyllis into a tormenting contradiction. To protect Daniel from Victor, she would need to tell more of the truth. But telling more of the truth might permanently destroy whatever remains of Daniel's trust in her. So she hesitates, stalls, lashes out, and tries to redirect blame toward Victor's cruelty, Jack's possible silence, and the broader environment of manipulation that has always polluted Genoa City. The problem is that she is no longer the narrator of this crisis. Her ability to frame herself as misunderstood has been shattered. Now every instinctive move toward control looks incriminating. Every deflection feels like one more theft. And the more she tries to contain the damage, the more Daniel becomes convinced that the deepest horror has still not been uncovered. The emotional center of the catastrophe lies in the idea of fatherhood, and what becomes of a son when that idea is fractured. Danny's place in Daniel's life may not vanish because biology is questioned, but the relationship can no longer exist untouched. Even love that survives revelation must pass through humiliation, anger, and grief. Daniel's agony is not just about losing certainty regarding blood. It is about what that loss does to memory. Suddenly, every embrace, every lesson, every conflict, every reconciliation becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation. Was he loved in truth or loved inside a lie? Did others pity Danny while allowing him to believe something false? Did Danny suspect more than he ever admitted? Did Phyllis see that bond as sacred or as useful? These questions do not stay neatly contained. They infect Daniel's ability to trust anyone. If something this foundational could be manipulated, then perhaps every relationship in his life carries hidden architecture, unseen supports designed by others to produce the outcomes they preferred. That is the kind of thinking that breeds paranoia, and paranoia in Genoa City rarely stays internal for long. It spills outward, turning wounded people into active threats. Jack eventually realizes that neutrality is impossible. He must either step closer to the truth and risk being dragged down by it, or step back and watch Daniel be consumed by the ugliest forces circling him. This is where his own internal war becomes most compelling. Jack has spent years trying to move beyond the old pattern in which he is forever reacting to Victor's manipulations and Phyllis's emotional detonations. Yet here he is again, drawn into a crisis that reopens both rivalries at once. If he once helped Phyllis bury part of the secret, even out of misguided compassion, then confession may be the only moral act left. But confession would not cleanse him. It would confirm everything Victor wants others to believe, that Jack, for all his claims to integrity, remains vulnerable to the same flawed impulses that have sabotaged him time and again. If, on the other hand, Jack's connection is less direct, then his dilemma becomes whether to expose what he suspects about Phyllis in order to save Daniel from further deception. That would be the right thing in a narrow sense, but it would also mean driving the knife deeper into a woman he once loved and perhaps still understands too well. In soap opera terms, that is exactly the kind of moral trap that causes the most damage, because every available choice carries both truth and betrayal inside it. Daniel's investigation soon uncovers signs that the falsified DNA record may have been only the first layer of a more elaborate operation. There are hints that someone monitored or manipulated related medical files over the years to ensure consistency. There may have been hush money, silent favors, or someone in a lab who profited from disappearing inconvenient facts. Daniel becomes convinced that whoever helped create this lie never intended it to remain temporary. It was designed to endure. That realization is devastating because it means the deception was not born from a moment of panic but from sustained intention. Entire years were spent maintaining the falsehood. Entire relationships evolved inside it. And if the lie was maintained with that much discipline, then perhaps other connected truths were buried too. Daniel begins to wonder whether his paternity was not the only thing stolen from him. Were other choices redirected? Other relationships influenced? Other exits closed before he even knew they existed? With every answer, The conspiracy grows in emotional size, and Daniel begins to look less like a man uncovering his past and more like a man descending into a system built to erase his right to know himself. This is when the story becomes truly dangerous, because Daniel's pain starts attracting people with motives of their own. Some see a victim. Some see leverage. Some see a chance to settle old scores by helping him target the people they already hate. Information starts reaching him in fragments, some genuine, some manipulative, all of it corrosive. His judgment begins to fray. He becomes harder, quicker to assume betrayal, more willing to break rules if doing so gets him closer to the source. The same man who once tried to rebuild from loss now risks being remade by it in darker form. That trajectory alarms those who still care about him. But it also satisfies a certain cruel logic within Genoa City, where suffering rarely remains pure and often mutates into legacy. Daniel's search for truth begins as an act of self-reclamation, yet the longer it continues, the more it threatens to transform into a war against everyone who ever shaped his life without permission. Phyllis can feel that transformation happening, and it terrifies her enough to contemplate the unthinkable, a full confession, not because she has become noble, but because she realizes partial lies are now gasoline. The problem is that confession itself is no simple release. If she tells Daniel everything, she may not merely lose him emotionally. She may expose others, trigger legal consequences, destroy remaining loyalties, and unleash retaliations from people who also needed this secret buried. The truth, once spoken, could produce a chain reaction she can no longer control. That is perhaps the most tragic dimension of her character here. She may genuinely love Daniel, but her version of love has too often involved deciding reality on his behalf. Even at the edge of exposure, she still thinks in terms of management, containment, preservation. She cannot fully surrender to truth because she has spent too many years surviving by editing it. And that inability may cost her everything, because sons can sometimes forgive terrible choices made from fear, but they rarely forgive a mother who keeps choosing control after the damage is undeniable. Victor, for all his apparent triumph, does not emerge morally clean. His exposure of the lie may be justified, but the brutality of his method leaves a mark. By turning Daniel's existential collapse into a public spectacle, he proves again that in his world, even truth is most valuable when it can be deployed as a weapon. That leaves open a grim possibility that Daniel, Phyllis, and Jack are all reacting inside a crisis that Victor ignited not solely to reveal wrongdoing, but to provoke a cascade of weakness he can later exploit in business, family politics, or both. In other words, even the truth here is contaminated by motive. That makes the emotional terrain especially brutal. No one gets the relief of a clean moral center. Phyllis may be guilty, Jack may be compromised, Daniel may be justified but increasingly unstable, and Victor may be correct for all the wrong reasons. That complexity is what gives the entire story its full tragic force. This is not merely about who lied. It is about what happens when the exposure of a lie is orchestrated by someone who understands that pain can be arranged into a strategy. By the time Daniel reaches the next stage of his search, the man he sees in the mirror is already changing. He is no longer satisfied with being told to be patient, to think clearly, to avoid burning down what little remains. He has spent too long living inside other people's decisions. Now he wants names, dates, motives, and consequences. He wants the original break in the chain. He wants to find the point at which his life stopped belonging solely to him. And the closer he gets, the more it appears that his real father may be only one piece of a larger and uglier truth, one involving deliberate manipulation by multiple players who believed the emotional, social, or strategic cost of honesty was simply too high. That is the final cruelty waiting in the shadows. Daniel may discover that the question of who fathered him matters less than the terrifying fact that several people found value in keeping him permanently uncertain. And so the storm deepens rather than settles. Phyllis stands on the edge of total personal ruin, torn between confession and self-preservation, between maternal love and the lifelong addiction to controlling outcomes. Jack finds himself dragged toward a reckoning that may expose whether his greatest weakness was not pride or rivalry, but compassion, given to the wrong person at the wrong time. Victor remains the ice-cold architect of an exposure that has blown apart the emotional balance of everyone involved, satisfied that once again he has proven how easily truth and domination can travel in the same hand. But it is Daniel who becomes the most volatile force of all, because a man stripped of identity can become capable of anything in his effort to reclaim it. Every new clue pushes him further away from the son others thought they knew, and closer to someone sharpened by betrayal, humiliated by years of manipulation, and unwilling to stop until every hidden player is dragged into the same light that destroyed him. In the end, what makes this story so devastating is not simply the possibility that Daniel is not Danny's biological son. It is the larger emotional wreckage unleashed by that possibility. Blood may define lineage, but truth defines dignity, and once dignity is stolen from a person's origin, every relationship built on top of it begins to tremble. That is why this scandal feels bigger than a paternity twist. It is a war over narrative ownership, over who had the right to write Daniel's life before he was old enough to challenge the script. And in a city where everyone claims to protect family while repeatedly sacrificing it to ambition, fear, and old wounds, that kind of war can never remain contained. It spreads through memory, inheritance, pride, and revenge until no one involved is still fighting for the same reason they began. What started as Victor's shocking exposure of a falsified DNA file becomes something darker and far more enduring. The birth of a new obsession, the collapse of an old identity, and the opening move in a deeper conspiracy Daniel is only beginning to understand. Because the worst part of having your life built on a lie is not discovering the lie itself. It is discovering that the people who shaped it may still be standing close enough to shape what comes next.